Hello, everybody out there on Facebook. My name is Bjorn Bjorholm. I'm a bonsai professional and the owner of bjornbjorholm.com. Tonight, I'm going to be answering some of your questions on Facebook Live. So, last year and the year before, I did a beginner's course and an intermediate course with bonsaiempire.com. And Oscar Jonker, the owner of Bonsai Empire, asked if I would do a Facebook Live session like this and answer some of the questions from both students and non-students. For those of you who haven't signed up for either of those courses, you can go to bonsaiempire.com or bjornbjorholm.com and sign up for the courses there. Once you sign up for the courses, you have lifetime access to all of the information in the videos. So first things first, I'm going to go through the questions that are already on the event page on Facebook. As I'm doing this, you people who are out there watching this video, if you've got questions of your own, feel free to throw them out. I'll try my best to get to some of them. We don't have a whole lot of time necessarily, so I'll get to as many questions as I possibly can. So I'm going to scroll down to the very bottom of the event page and start with the very first question that was asked. So this question comes from Massimo Santoro, and if I butcher your names, I'm very sorry about that. His question is, I'm 22 and bonsai is a part of my life now for 5 years. How is the process of becoming an apprentice in Japan, or what is the process of becoming an apprentice in Japan? So for me, I went to Japan when I was 22 to become an apprentice. And at the time, I had met Fujikawa-san a few years prior to that. Fujikawa-san was my teacher, under whom I studied for about 6 years. I had written him via email for about 6 months back and forth, asking for a 3-month trial period to come over, see if things would work out, and then eventually, hopefully, to launch that into a full-on bonsai apprenticeship. So what I did, I went over in the summer. I did my 3-month trial period, and eventually Fujikawa-san decided that it would be a good idea to take me on as an apprentice. So I ended up staying for about 6 years, and then I got certified by the Japanese Bonsai Association a couple years ago, and I've been working as a bonsai professional in Japan since then. So now what people tend to do is participate in short-term programs at bonsai nurseries in Japan, say 2 weeks, 1 month, 3 months, and try to launch that into a full-on apprenticeship. So there's several schools that you can participate in. I recommend that you go onto Google and search through some of those and see if there's a place in Japan that sort of suits your particular taste or your particular style or what you want to learn. And approach that nursery, ask them if they have an opportunity to do a short-term program, and then see if potentially you can launch that into a long-term bonsai apprenticeship. So just keep in mind that a bonsai apprenticeship in Japan officially is 5 years minimum. Typically they end up lasting 5.5, 6 years, sometimes a bit longer. Just depends on your teacher, with the goal of eventually becoming certified by the Japanese Bonsai Association. So thank you for your question. The second question comes from George Haas. He says, I first learned to pinch junipers to maintain the shape and to thin out branches and pads. What is the correct way to shape and thin out juniper foliage? Thank you. So we cover this in one of the videos in our Bonsai Intermediate course. And again, you can go to bonsaiempire.com to sign up for that. But yeah, general sort of wisdom is that you should go through and pinch your juniper foliage. That is in fact incorrect. You're going to end up damaging the tree if you do that. So the reason that happens is because in the tip of every single individual little bitty tip on juniper foliage, there's a hormone called auxin. That auxin essentially tells the branch to continue to grow, and more specifically to grow upward towards the light. So if you go through and pinch off all of those tips, you essentially remove all of that auxin and you tell that branch to stop growing. So the branch is just going to sit there until it sort of peters out and dies. So the best way to thin out your juniper foliage or cut back your juniper foliage is actually to take your scissors and go back on the semi-hardwood shoot between the foliage and clip that out. That'll leave the native auxin intact in the remaining tips, and the branch will continue to grow from there. So great question. Thank you very much for posting it. The next question comes from Matt Ruff. Dear Bjorn, first of all, thanks a lot for this great opportunity. Well, thank you for posting your question. I have a problem with a quite old Acer palmatum arakawa. That's a rough bark Japanese maple. Every spring it suffers from inner branch dieback. This seems to appear at random, i.e. it doesn't follow any logical pattern. For example, only the very inner branches or so. Could partial defoliation, i.e. one leaf of each pair, help to prevent this problem by exposing inner branches to more air and light throughout the growing season? Yes, actually, that's probably the best approach to that. If in fact it's just your inner branches and inner leaves that are dying off, more than likely they're not getting enough light and air circulation. So the best approach with a Japanese maple, whether it be a standard Acer palmatum, an Arakawa, a Shishigashira, doesn't really matter. The best approach is to go through and in the spring, cut back to the first pair of leaves and then take one leaf off in each pair. What that's going to do is allow about 50% more light and air to enter to the inside of the tree. If that's still not allowing enough light and air to get in, that remaining leaf, you can take that, fold it in half, and then cut it on a backwards angle, and that'll allow another 50% more. So you've essentially allowed about 75% more light and air to reach the inner buds of the tree. This will help keep those alive. It'll also help promote back budding. One thing to keep in mind though with the Arakawa is that it tends to be a relatively weak cultivar in comparison to your standard Acer palmatum. Particularly the apex of the tree will be weak. So if you're going to remove one leaf in each pair on the tree, I recommend that you leave the apex alone, meaning don't cut any of the leaves off the apex. That'll give more of a photosynthetic surface to the top of the tree, and it'll help keep that top healthier and hopefully prolong its life. The biggest issue is as these trees get older, the apex will start to die off, and you'll be forced to have to redirect a new branch up to the top to create a new apex, which can cause a lot of trouble in the long run. So I recommend that, yes, do the partial outer canopy defoliation, cutting one leaf off in each pair, but don't do it to the apex on an Arakawa rough bark Japanese maple. All right, so let's scroll up here. And again, I'm not going to be able to get to all of these questions, so if I skip your question, I apologize in advance. All right, the next question is from Hector Quintero. He says, when growing a new apex on a juniper, what are structural aspects to consider? Okay, so if you're working with a very young plant, really the best way to approach the apex is just to stand a single branch upward and then work on developing lateral branches out from there over time. If you're working with a tree that's a bit older that already has quite a bit of foliage at the top to work with, of course, we want to try to create kind of a rounded top to the apex and bring the apex down and low. It makes the tree look older, weightier, and more mature. So when you're placing branches on an apex, whether it be a juniper or a pine, it doesn't really matter. One of the biggest issues that I see in design is that people tend to create an apex that has almost like a helmet type look to it. Excuse me, a helmet type look to it. So the best way to avoid that is when you create the apex, the bottom line to the apex, don't make it all a single line all around. That's going to give you that helmet look, right? Break that line up in several different places all the way to the very top of the tree. So even within that rounded structure, you want to have some visible lines, and you want to make sure that they aren't too wide. They don't cross the entire front of the tree, because that's going to give you that helmet look to the plant. So just keep that in mind. The other thing too is that it's okay to have a little bit of a bald spot on the backside of the apex, but you don't want to leave a gaping hole back there. So make sure that you're arranging foliage in a way that over time can fill in nicely and give you a full rounded top to the tree. But again, there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of a bald spot in the back as long as you can cover that up over time. Okay. All right, let's scroll up here. The next one is Jay Stevenson. Hi Bjorn, I bought a fairly developed black pine in January, and the previous owner had grown several U-shaped divisions in the branch structure. Some are quite thick. What's the best way to address these? Okay, so my guess is what happened with the previous owner is that when they selected for the branches, they probably waited a bit too long, and they had, say, 4, 5, 6 buds that had elongated and turned into branches at a single joint. They probably went through, cut out the ones that they didn't particularly like, and that's what left that weird sort of U-shaped branch structure at the end of the branch. So if it's really, really bad, maybe your best option is going to be to graft new foliage further back in on the branches, and then eliminate that U-shape after those grafts are taken by cutting the longer part of the branch off. The other option would be out of that U-shape pattern, if you were to go through and cut off one side and try to redirect the other side with a piece of wire, or if it's still thin enough and you can redirect both of them to get more of a V shape rather than a U shape, that might be another option. So it really just depends on how extreme the U-shaped divisions are. So from the sound of it though, you're probably going to be better off grafting new branches back on the inside of the tree. Okay, so let's scroll up a little further here. Okay, so this one comes from Ron Maurer. I live in Colorado, which is beautiful but very dry. So watering is a challenge with any type of plant, let alone bonsai. Even with such a dry climate, I'm getting a white fungus in the soil. I've tried a lot of things to solve this, but any suggestion would be appreciated. Okay, so it sounds to me like this is mycorrhiza in your soil, and mycorrhiza is actually a bacteria that you want in your soil. It's a beneficial bacteria. Really, the point of mycorrhiza is to essentially expand the overall volume of the root system and allow more nutrients to be absorbed by the tree through the roots. So it's a great bacteria to have. In many instances, we actually try to add mycorrhiza into the soil because it does help with the intake of nutrients and water as well. So I wouldn't worry too much about having the mycorrhiza in your soil. If you're getting a black fungus or if your roots smell when you take the tree out of the pot, that might be a problem. It could be a sign of root rot, but the white fungus is not an issue at all. All right, thanks for that question. All right, let's roll up here. This one comes from William Woods. Could you recommend a book or general reference on everything bonsai, watering, light, trimming, repotting? Well, as a general reference, I would say sign up for our Bonsai Intermediate course and our Bonsai Beginner course at bonsaiempire.com. The beginner course is very, very basic. It covers just very simple elements of bonsai design, of horticulture, repotting, which kind of pot to choose. It's very, very general. It's, I think, about an hour and a half for the whole course. If you sign up for the intermediate course, though, it's about 3.5 or 4 hours worth of content, and it gets really into the nitty gritty of each individual species or some of the more popular species that we use for bonsai. So that's my first recommendation. If you want a book, I think probably the best book that's come out in the last couple of years, would be the DK handbook, Bonsai Handbook. The original book was written by Harry Tomlinson with DK Publishing, but there's been an updated version that just got put out recently. Peter Warren was the author of that book. He's a great bonsai artist, knows his stuff, did a really great job putting that together. So I'd recommend looking on maybe Amazon.com or even potentially contacting Peter directly and seeing if you can get a hold of that book. But it's the DK Bonsai reference book. So that would be my recommendation if you want to go for a book. All right, let's scroll up here. This one is by Daniel T. Mora. Can you share specifics for overwintering conifers and deciduous trees in a very cold climate like Chicago? Okay, so it really depends on what kind of conifer it is and what kind of deciduous tree it is as to how low of a temperature it can take. In general, with temperate climate trees, if you have an environment that you can keep them in where it hovers right around freezing at the lowest and you can keep it consistently, say between 33 and 35, say in a greenhouse or an overwintering house where you've got a fan that's blowing that's keeping it at that consistent temperature, that's your best bet. But most people can't do that. So what I would recommend is if it's something like a general conifer, let's say a juniper or maybe a white pine or a high elevation tree that in its normal environment can get down to very low temperatures, I'd still recommend trying to put it in an unheated garage if the temperatures are going to get below about 20, 22 degrees Fahrenheit, which is going to be, I think, around -6, -7 Celsius. So if you've got an unheated garage, put it in there at least for the evening or overnight when it's going to get really, really low. And then you can put it back outside if the temperatures are going to go up a little bit during the day the next day. With deciduous trees, I try to keep them a little bit warmer if possible, so just below freezing. So if you're getting down to, say 27, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is going to be probably -2, -3 Celsius, I would do the same thing. I'd bring it into an unheated garage if possible, just for the evening or until those temperatures come back up a little bit. So that's probably your best bet if you don't have the opportunity to build a greenhouse or an overwintering house. Okay. Let's scroll up here. All right, this next one comes from Gennaro Capuano. So sorry if I messed up your name there. Can you share an alternative to keto for creating a bonsai on the rock and the percentage of the mix? So for those who don't know, keto is essentially peat muck. You can buy it in bags in Japan. They're pre-made. It's really, really nice product. It's easy to use. We usually use that for building a wall, for example, on a flat slab when we're trying to plant a bonsai on that. it's a nice organic sticky substance that will hold the soil in place when we plant the tree inside on a flat rock, or if you're building up on a taller rock and you need to hold the soil, then you can pack the Keto around the outside edge. So excuse me, an alternative for Keto, probably the easiest way to create a Keto-like substance would be to take the dust from your bonsai soil. So in particular, if you're using something like akadama, which is a substrate that you can get from Japan, or you can get from dealers in the US and in Europe and all over the world, imported from Japan. You can use the dust from that, and you can mix it with sphagnum, cut up sphagnum moss, and then with water as well. And that's going to give you a nice, really sticky substance. It's essentially what Keto is, basically. So it's going to be, there are all sorts of different ideas about how much you should mix, but as long as you're going at least 50% with the akadama dust, 50% with the sphagnum moss, and then you can mix in the water until you get it sort of really sticky consistency, that should hold well enough if you're creating a rock planting. So good question. Okay, scroll up a little further here. All right, so this next one comes from Nathan Golod. Hi, first of all, this is awesome what you're doing here, letting us ask questions. Well, thank you for taking time to post a question. I took the beginner course. It's a great one. Thank you for signing up for that. My question is, I have a bonsai myrtle tree on a balcony railing. Now in our country, the winter is coming. Where do I put the tree for the winter? Thanks. So this ties into what the previous question was about what you should do with certain conifers and certain deciduous trees when you're overwintering them in a really cold environment like Chicago. So Nathan didn't post where exactly he's from, so I'm not sure exactly how cold it gets there. But really, again, it depends on what kind of myrtle it is. It depends on if it's a bit more of a temperate myrtle, or if it's going to be something from a more subtropical or tropical type area, as to how you should overwinter it. So you're really going to have to search out the exact species and figure out the lowest possible temperature it can get down to, and then go up from there. So again, if it's a relatively temperate tree, try to keep it around freezing, maybe slightly above freezing. If you've got an unheated garage or someplace where you can bring it in where it's not going to get super hard frost, that'll be your best bet. So yeah, but again, make sure you are researching the exact species of myrtle that it is before you make that decision. Okay, this next question comes from Gil Tom. Would you be ready to do a bonsai battle with Ryan Neal, the other rock star of the bonsai world? Funny you should ask that. In about 3 weeks from now, Ryan and I are going to be headlining the Golden State Bonsai Federation Convention. It's going to be in Sacramento, California from October 26th through the 30th at the Doubletree by Hilton. So if you guys want to sign up to participate in that, or to come watch us give demonstrations, or to participate in any of the workshops that we're offering, you can go to gsbfconvention.org and sign up there. There's also going to be tons of other guest artists there. So Kathy Shaner will be there, David Nui, Ted Mattson, Kenji Miyata, Peter T, Bob Scheiman, a ton of other people. So it's going to be a really great event, but that's a very timely question. So thank you for posting that on there. All right, next question, let's see, is by Raphael. I'm not even going to try to pronounce your last name, so but this fellow is from Canada. So the question is, it seems when it comes to demonstrations, it doesn't matter what time of the year it is with regards to wiring, bending, and cutting. We rarely know if the tree survives anyway. What's up with that? So I think what you're getting at is when you go to a demo, quite often a lot of heavy bending and twisting and cutting and wiring is done, and the trees tend not to survive after the demonstration. So as a bonsai professional who travels around and teaches all over the world and does demonstrations everywhere, doing a demonstration is one of those things that's sort of like a double-edged sword for a bonsai professional, because getting on stage and turning a tree from, say, a bush into a finished product in 2 or 3 hours is a difficult thing to do. The goal is to, wow the audience and really transform the tree into something beautiful, but also make sure that the tree survives afterwards. So I always try to walk that fine line and make sure that what I do to the plant is the right thing to do at that time of year. Quite often I'll leave more foliage than I might otherwise do if it was a different time of year, or I may only take a branch a certain distance during the demonstration with the intention of telling the person who owns the tree or wins the tree in a raffle after the demonstration that they can do this, that, and the other to move the tree along in terms of design and horticulture and health and whatnot. So it's a really difficult thing for us as demonstrators to transform the tree into something that looks like a final product and then guarantee that it's going to survive afterwards, because we have no control over who maintains the tree once the demonstration is over. And the maintenance after the demonstration is by far more important than what we do during the demonstration itself. So I think if a demonstration was done and something extreme was done to a tree, if that tree was maintained properly afterwards, either by another professional or by someone who sort of knows what they're doing, the likelihood that the tree would survive would be relatively high in most cases, but that doesn't always happen. So I hope that answers your question there. Okay, let's scroll up here. The next one is from Jonathan Lee. Hey, Jonathan, how you doing? Can I have your thoughts on preparing trees, both evergreens and deciduous, in fertilizing, wiring, etc., or any preparation for cooler weather and eventually winter? Also on this note, would really like to know what to do with my accent plants during the cooler months, as I have haven't really kept any through winter yet. Thanks. Okay, so let's go back to the first question. Can I have your thoughts on preparing trees, both evergreens and deciduous, in fertilizing, wiring, etc., or any preparation for cooler weather? Okay. This is a bit difficult to discuss in this particular type of forum because there's such a broad range of species that we work with. Every species is slightly different in terms of how we treat them horticulturally, how we wire them, the approach to styling. What I would say, your best bet, and not to pawn off the answer or push it off or punt on it, but the best thing to do really is going to be to sign up for the Bonsai Intermediate course at bonsaiempire.com, because what we do in that course is we break the videos up into different sections. Each video covers one particular species or a group of species that can all be treated somewhat the same horticulturally. So if you go watch those videos, there's a video on junipers, for example. It covers how to fertilize them based on what particular stage they're in terms of development, refinement, health, etc. Same thing for apricots, for Stewardia, for white pines, black pines, red pines. So all of these videos can be found in the Bonsai Intermediate course at bonsaiempire.com. So sorry to punt on the question, but it's just going to be too much, I think, to cover in this section right here. As for your last question, what do you do with accent plants during the cooler months? All right, so slight confession here. At Fujikawa-san's place, during the winter in Japan is exhibition season. So during the winter, what we do, we don't actually grow our own accent plants. We buy them from other nurseries and use them in the exhibitions there. So we don't particularly overwinter anything accent plant wise. So in Japan, I can't necessarily answer your question from that front. But in general, you're going to treat the accent plants essentially the same as you're going to treat some of your more tender trees, like your deciduous trees, maybe even your subtropical, semi-tropical trees, putting them in either a hothouse, a greenhouse, or some area where it's not really going to get below freezing and you can keep a consistent temperature just above freezing. Again, it depends on the species of accent plant that you're working with, but they tend to be quite a bit more tender because they're in general in much smaller pots than the bonsai. So yeah, make sure you have an unheated garage, a greenhouse, something along those lines that you can use depending on the species of tree. Okay, let's scroll up here. All right, next question comes from Jamie Schnack. With wanting to aim for dense foliage, should I prune lightly or fairly hard, and before or after new growth, mainly on junipers and azaleas? Okay, great question. I'm going to set the azaleas to the side here. My training in Japan, we didn't work at all with azaleas, so I'm not going to give you any false information. There are plenty of references out there to go check out azaleas, so I don't want to give you wrong information and send you on your way, so we'll set the azaleas to the side. But to answer your question about junipers, really it depends on the species of junipers, but in general, if you're talking about Shinpakusei, Itoigawa, Kishu, anything that's Junipers chinensis, this also goes for, say, Rocky Mountain junipers, Sabina junipers, most junipers in general. you're going to let the foliage flush out in the spring, and depending on where you live, you're going to have to adjust this slightly. But in most temperate climates, we let the foliage elongate until, let's say, the end of May, beginning of June or so, right? You'll get tip growth, quite long shoot growth if the tree is healthy. You can go back through and cut that growth out. The end of May, beginning of June is a good time to do the first pruning on them. It's not an exact science with most junipers, so somewhere in that range is fine. After you prune that out, the foliage below that, behind that shoot, is going to start to puff out, and you're going to get another runner in certain areas, and you can go through and cut that out again later in the summer. Say sometime in September is usually a decent time to do it. That's going to give you volume to your foliage. It's also going to push the foliage back and keep it into a nice uniform shape. And you're also going to avoid having reversion to juvenile foliage if you're cutting the foliage that way rather than pinching. So great question. All right, let's roll up here. Let's see. All right, this next question comes from, let's see, Gregory Scott. Okay. I am totally new to bonsai, and I have these Japanese black pine seedlings growing and not sure what to do at this point. They will only be around 4 months old when we start getting into the freezing, at nights anyway, part of the year. Zone 6. Will they survive? Should I cover them with mulch? Bring them inside for a few months and use a grow light? What's the best approach here? So great question. There's a picture of these on here as well. I'll try to spin this around so you guys can see. I don't know if you can see that picture there, right? So these seedlings are, he says, are only about 4 months old, right? So they're still relatively, very fresh, actually. I would be surprised if the growth is even hardened off on them. In this case, I would bring them in to an area that's not going to freeze, and I would protect them all winter. I would not cover them up with mulch. Really, my suggestion over the winter is don't cover anything with mulch, because you can't tell if the tree is dried out or if it's completely sopping wet with water all winter long. In either case, it's going to cause you major problems. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend mulching anything in. With these in particular, though, I would bring them in to either, again, an unheated garage or an area where it's not going to get below freezing. And then next year, you should get quite a bit of growth out of them as long as they're nice and healthy. And then the following year, you may be able to keep them outside when it gets below freezing. So something to think about, though, with Japanese black pines, they're actually a coastal tree in Japan. So the temperatures along the coast don't tend to get too ridiculously cold. So I would protect your black pines in general if you're getting down, again, to say -6, -7 degrees Celsius or about 20, 22 degrees Fahrenheit. I put them in an unheated garage or something. If you're talking about something like a Japanese white pine, for example, that's a high elevation tree. They can take much lower temperatures. So I wouldn't worry too much if the temperatures dip below that. But with the black pines, you got to be a little more careful. Okay, next question is from Sam John. He says, I am from India and would need your advice on bonsai soil mix. Okay, so just in general, in Japan, what we use for a soil mix, we break it up into two basic categories. We've got the broadleaf evergreen and deciduous trees, and then the conifers. The conifers, in general, tend to like to stay a bit more on the dry side. So what we typically use is a mix of akadama, what's essentially lava rock, and pumice, right? So 3 components. And we usually mix them in a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. That gives us a nice free draining soil mix. The akadama will help hold a little bit of moisture and also help hold fertilizer. So where we are, it gets in the summer up to, say, 37, 38 degrees Celsius, which is in the 90s, the upper 90s Fahrenheit. It's about 95, 100% humidity. So we want a very porous mix during that time of year. For the conifers, and for the deciduous trees and broadleaf evergreens, we do a 2-to-1-to-1 ratio with 2 parts akadama, 1 part lava rock, and 1 part pumice. The akadama, again, will hold a bit more moisture, which is better for some of the deciduous and broadleaf evergreen trees. Where you are in India, it's going to be incredibly hot in the summer, and I'm not sure about the humidity. I have no idea if, my guess is it's incredibly humid down there as well. So for most things, you're probably, if it's getting incredibly hot, you may want to put a little more akadama in there to hold a bit more of the moisture. But again, it depends on the species of tree that you're working with. So again, where we are, you want to make sure that you use something that is very porous, and probably where you are as well, porous, but still holds a bit of moisture. And really the best mix that I can recommend for almost anything is akadama, pumice, and lava rock. If you don't have access to Akadama, you can use pure pumice. You can use a mix of pumice and lava rock, but I don't recommend that you put any organic stuff in your soil. So meaning like pine bark, peat. Don't put stuff like that in your soil, even though it looks like it's going to hold a lot of water, which it does. It's going to compact a lot faster than something like pumice, lava rock, or Akadama. So you're much better off using larger particle soil mixes. So the particle size that we typically use is about 1/8 of an inch, which I believe is about 3 millimeters. So relatively decent size, quite large soil particle size that allows a lot of oxygen penetration and allows the water to drain freely through the soil. And you can get great root growth out of that as long as you're watering on a consistent basis. So all of these things have to be considered. Again, if you want to check out the Bonsai Intermediate course, we cover this for each species, the best soil mix, the best approach to watering, and also to fertilization. So there's a combination of all three of those that's going to get the best growth depending on the species. So great question. Okay, so that covers quite a few of the questions that are on the event page here on Facebook. So I'm going to go through and pick out just a couple of questions that are getting sent in here on the live feed. So, all right, let's do this one. This one just came in. This is from Emil Benke. Again, I'm sorry if I messed up your name. The question is, I have a Kokonoe white pine with an absolutely horrible Nabari. Nabari is the surface root structure. I've used air layering on Deciduous to create new Nabari. I have been told numerous times that it can't be done on pines or evergreens, but I've seen it done in an old Bonsai magazine from Japan. So my question is, can I improve the Nabari on my pines with air layering? The simple answer is maybe. So it really depends on how old the tree is. It depends on your approach to it, the timing of year that you do it. But if you do it correctly, you should be able to do it on your pines, particularly a white pine. White pine should do it better than, say, an old black pine. It also depends on how corky or fissured the bark is. If it's a really old tree, it's quite unlikely, if it's a black pine, white pine, doesn't matter. It's quite unlikely that you're going to get the air layer to actually take. You can still attempt it. More than likely, it's going to take you probably 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 growing seasons to get enough roots to be able to remove the original root structure once you do the air layer. So again, it just depends on the age of the tree, it depends on how fissured the bark is, but I'd say the simple answer is, yeah, probably you could do it, but you have to approach it correctly. So good question. All right, let's see what else we got coming in here. Scroll up through here. Let's see. This one comes from Victor Sings. Hi Bjorn, my Chinese elm is turning yellow on a daily basis now that winter is coming. I am watering and feeding it properly. The only thing is that it stays close to a heater and next to a window. Let's see, next to a window which stays slightly open. Could this be the reason? Where should I position it? All right, so with winter coming, that's normal that your Chinese elm is going to be turning colors if you're keeping it outdoors. The reason that your Chinese elm is probably turning colors that you're keeping it inside next to a heater is just because of that. It's next to a heater. So you may want to check the branches and make sure that they're not becoming crispy and breakable, because if they are, that means that the branch tips are dying off and you want to get it away from that heater. With a Chinese elm, it depends on the cultivar and where it was propagated and where it originated as to what temperature range you can keep it in. So some Chinese elms are cultivated to be more of a temperate type tree. Some of them are a bit more sort of subtropical. So you're going to have to figure out exactly where that tree came from, because if you're living in a temperate climate, but that tree was propagated somewhere where it was more of a subtropical or quite a bit warmer climate, you're not really going to be able to take that tree and stick it outside to try to get it to drop its leaves like a temperate tree, like a deciduous tree. So you're just going to have to make sure of that. But my guess is right now the biggest problem is it's being kept on a heater. So get it away from the heater if you can. Okay. All right, here's a question from Jeremiah Pierce. Ponderosa pines, what's the best way to create pads on those? Okay, so for those of you who don't know what a ponderosa pine is, it's a pine from the western United States. I believe it's the most prolific pine in the entire United States. It covers, I mean, huge ranges all across the western half of the U.S. The needles on those trees tend to be very, very, very long. You can reduce them over time with proper techniques. So really, probably the best technique would be when you get a Ponderosa pine, typically they don't have a lot of foliage on them. They tend to be relatively sparse, but with long needles. What you can do is heavily fertilize until you get back budding on the tree, right? Once you get back budding on the plant and you get enough foliar density on the tree, you can cut the fertilizer during the summer months, during the growing season. What that'll do is start to reduce the size of the needles. And then in the fall, once the new growth for the summer is fully hardened off, then you can start fertilizing, say from September through November or so. That'll allow for a little bit of nutrient buildup in the soil, which will be good for the following year, right? So you'll reduce the needle size that way, and you'll also get back budding on the tree by having fertilized it heavily the year before or several years before. So in terms of creating pads, with the ponderosas, I approach those a bit more like I would a black pine in terms of the way I create the pads, meaning that I fan the pads out like a hand shape, which gets light and air to the intersections of the branch. You do this during fertilization when you're heavily fertilizing the tree year round. You'll get nice back buds on the tree, and you can create a nice soft branch structure that way and nice pads. What you can't do is treat a ponderosa like a black pine in terms of decandling the tree. So we can't go through in the summer and cut off the new candle growth expecting a second flush of growth. So you have to make sure you're delineating or separating between the two. So certain techniques, we treat the ponderosa similar to a black pine in terms of how we create the pads, but we don't treat them the same way in terms of how we decandle. So you really have to understand this information. And again, if you sign up for the Bonsai Intermediate course at bonsaiempire.com or bjornbjorholm.com, you can see all of this in video format in much more detail. So I recommend that you do that. Great question. Okay. I think we're going to do probably one or two more questions here, and then we'll close out the session for this time. All right, let's see. Got lots of stuff coming in. Thank you guys for posting all of this on here. Let's see. All right, so here's a real general question. It comes from Kaglar Ozoy. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. How do I prevent diseases and insects from infecting my bonsai? So you're going to have to take sort of a multi-level approach to this question as well. Again, it depends on the species. It depends on the time of year. It depends on where you live, what exists in your general area. But as a general rule of thumb, you do want to spray preventively at least 2 or 3 times a year. What we do at Kokan in Japan is we only spray about twice per year, only during the growing season, and we use a mix of a general but relatively potent fungicide and pesticide. And we spray everything in the nursery with that, and that tends to take care of pretty much any problem we have. For us, though, we're lucky being where we are because it's surrounded by what's essentially concrete. So we're this little oasis in a concrete jungle. So we don't have to worry about fungus from a nearby forest or insects from nearby plants infecting the bonsai. Most people don't live in an environment like that. So you're going to have to spray probably more regularly. And you do want to take a preventative approach, but you're also going to have to spray specifically for things like mites with junipers, tip blight with junipers, certain candle-eating caterpillars with different kinds of pines. So you need to identify the exact problem that you have with your tree and then find a product that's going to target that specific problem. So it's a bit of a difficult question to answer because it's quite general, but as a general rule of thumb, spray preventively and then also keep an eye on things. And if you find a problem, spray specifically for that particular issue. Okay. Let's scroll up here a little further. See what else we got. Okay, this will be the last question for tonight, so I appreciate you guys posting this. This one comes from Leston Jones. It says, have you got any advice for overwintering Zuisho Japanese white pine in Britain, mainly with regard to temperatures, location, etc.? Okay, so Zuisho Japanese white pine is a cultivar of Pinus parviflora. They tend to have very small needles. The trunks thicken very quickly, which makes them a great cultivar to work with bonsai. Most Zuisho white pines that are created or cultivated in Japan and then imported to other parts of the world are actually grafted on Japanese black pine root bases. So overwintering those, you want to make sure that you treat the tree more like a Japanese black pine, meaning that, as we said earlier, Japanese black pines are a coastal tree. They don't particularly like super low temperatures. So if you're getting down to -6, -7 Celsius, 20, 22 degrees Fahrenheit, put the tree in an area like an unheated garage where you can keep it up, closer to freezing, somewhere in that range, because the black pine roots don't like the cold temperatures. If it's a Zuisho white pine and you know that it's on its own root base, perhaps you can treat it a little bit more like a standard Pinus parviflora, meaning that it can take slightly lower temperatures. But again, as a general rule of thumb, make sure that you're protecting a tree like Japanese white pine Zuisho in the winter. In Britain, my guess is it's a bit more rainy in the winter, a little bit wetter in the winter. So because most of the Zuishos are grafted on black pine root bases, black pines tend to like a little more water than a standard Pinus parviflora on its own root structure. So they can maybe take the rainy temperatures or the rainy weather a little bit better, but I still wouldn't let them stay sopping wet either. So really overwinter, you're best off putting it in an unheated area, but make sure that it still gets enough light, because white pine and all conifers that maintain their leaves during the winter are going to be photosynthesizing all winter long. So if you do have an unheated garage or a greenhouse of some sort where you can keep it around freezing, make sure that you're getting enough light to the tree as well. Okay, so thank you guys for tuning in. I hope that I answered some of your questions to a degree that can help you out. If you guys want more information or you want to get a better sense of bonsai art and the horticulture behind it, please sign up for the Bonsai Beginner course and the Bonsai Intermediate course at bonsaiempire.com or bjornbjorholm.com. All of the information on there, once you sign up for it, you have lifetime access to it. So you can watch it year after year after year as you're working alongside with your plants. So again, thank you guys very much for tuning in, and I appreciate it. So talk to you later.